It's Monday, the 3rd of October. This is Politics Live from the Conservative Party conference in Birmingham. Joining me today, Telegraph columnist Tim Stanley, The Guardian's North of England editor Helen Pidd, and former Business Minister Greg Hands. Today, after 10 days of turmoil, a screeching U-turn from the Chancellor.
This 45p rate was simply a distraction in our mission to achieve higher growth.
But this was the Prime Minister just yesterday.
Are you absolutely committed to abolishing the 45p tax rate for the wealthiest people in the country? Yes.
But she has now given in to rebellious MPs, like Michael Gove.
The headline tax moved, cutting tax for the wealthiest. That is a display of the wrong.
And all before City traders got to their desks this morning. And party members arrived here at the conference centre in Birmingham. We'll be gauging the reaction. Welcome to Politics Live here in Birmingham. So we woke up this morning to that screeching U-turn on the government's policy to cut the top rate of tax from 45p to 40, despite the Prime Minister, Liz Truss, only 12 hours before doubling down on the policy. What has this U-turn done to the credibility of Liz Truss and her government, Greg?
Well, look, I don't think the 45p tax rate was actually a big part of the government's growth plan.
Well, why have they U-turned on it then?
It wasn't actually part of Liz Truss's prospectus for becoming elected leader of the Conservative Party.
But it was part of that mini-budget last week. If you don't think it's a big deal, why have they U-turned on it?
It wasn't part of the a big part of the growth plan. It was part of the announcement. The bigger part, the most important part of this, is actually the energy package and the bigger, wider tax cut for 30 million people of up to £430. That is actually the bigger part of that. And that was also part of Liz's leadership prospectus over the summer, and that is very much
But my question is, what has the U-turn, however you want to characterise that cut in 45p to 40p? You heard Michael Gove. It wasn't in standing with Conservative values. We heard Grant Shapps saying there has to be a reversal of this policy. The polls had already shown complete decimation for the Conservative Party, not just on the 45p, but other tax-cutting messages. So I say, what has the U-turn done to the credibility of Liz Truss and her government?
Look, I think the credibility of Liz Truss and the government is based very much more on the major policy proposals that are being made, the sort of things that were part of the summer Conservative leadership campaign, which are very much the energy package, a huge amount of support going to British households for their energy, and the major tax cuts for hard-working families, the 1p off the base rate of income tax, which will give around £430 extra into a household's pocket.
Except it was clear, of course, that that was not what actually sent the markets into turmoil. What do you think this U-turn has done to Liz Truss's authority? She was sat in a studio yesterday saying, I'm committed to that policy of abolishing the top rate of tax.
It's been a disaster. It's been a disaster because Greg is right. The biggest part of the package was the 60 billion to help people through the winter. But they allowed that whale of a package to be distracted by a piranha of the 2 billion cut of the 45p highest rate. That's a political mistake, not just in communications, by the way, but also generally in policy, because if you allow a big policy to be sunk by a smaller one, then it's gone horribly wrong. Now, Liz Truss is often compared in style and substance to Margaret Thatcher. And of course, in the early 80s, there was a big battle at conference between the wets and the dries over economic policy. Well, this is a sort of alternative reality in which the wets won. Michael Gove is this season's Ted Heath, and the lady, it turns out, is for turning. You can't do something this controversial, stake everything on it, go out there and defend it, and then U-turn on it. That's a double mistake, to have done it in the first place and then to U-turn on it, so you first look mistaken and you secondly look weak.
But is it the right thing to do, Helen? Has Liz Truss and has Kwasi Kwarteng come to the conclusion that they were left with no choice but to do it and bring their party back together?
clearly, I'm sure it went against every bone in their body to have to admit that they'd made a mistake. I was having lunch yesterday with a Red Wall MP and I said, so you're going to vote for this package? This is a very loyal Red Wall MP. And he went, moot point, it's not going to happen. But then last night, somehow I ended up at the 1922 party. They let me in and Liz Truss was there 10:30 last night. No mention of this. So it was clearly some sort of dark night of the soul when they came to this conclusion. But, you know, they had to make this decision. But the problem is they've neutralised the policy, but they haven't neutralised the perception that the Tory party is once again the party of the rich.
Let's just remind people how we actually got to this point. It all started 10 days ago on the 23rd of September with Kwasi Kwarteng, the Chancellor's mini-budget. Let's have a listen.
I'm not going to cut the additional rate of tax today, Mr. Speaker. I'm going to abolish it altogether. From April the 23rd, we will have a single higher rate of income tax of 40%. This will simplify the tax system and make Britain more competitive. It will reward enterprise and work. It will incentivise growth. It will benefit the whole economy and the whole country.
So that was Kwasi Kwarteng setting out the policy and why they were going to introduce it. Following that statement, we saw the market in turmoil. We were, in fact, live on Politics Live as the pound began to fall following that statement from Kwasi Kwarteng. Then there was criticism from the International Monetary Fund and a £65 billion intervention by the Bank of England to calm the markets. More significantly, we also saw, as you can see here, bond yields going up, the price of government borrowing. As you can see, it shoots up after that statement on the 23rd of September to 4.4%. The Prime Minister then doubled down.
Can I ask you, Prime Minister, did you discuss scrapping the top rate with your whole cabinet?
No. No, we didn't. It was a decision that the Chancellor made.
Well, there's been a week of doubling down on this, but yesterday we heard former Cabinet Minister, senior Conservative politician Michael Gove imply that he wouldn't actually vote in favour of it. And to some extent, that gave licence to other Conservative MPs to say the same. And then the former Transport Secretary, Grant Shapps, intervened.
The problem is, and I noticed this talking to my constituents this weekend, that what they're seeing is money being borrowed in order to fund tax cuts for the better off, whilst they themselves are having to, for example, take on a second shift, another job, in order to pay for the rise in interest rates and mortgage rates. So let's not muddy the water with this other thing, this tax cut for wealthy people right now, when the priority needs to be on everyday households.
Grant Shapps there intervening and talking to the BBC's political editor, Chris Mason. Then overnight, in the early hours of this morning, there was this tweet from Harry Cole in The Sun. Liz Truss preparing to ditch 45p rate policy today after late crisis talks with the Chancellor. Humiliating climb-down plan comes after day of acrimony in Broome. Announcement expected in the morning in body blow to new government, which, of course, we had. It was followed and confirmed by the Chancellor himself. We get it, he tweeted, and we have listened. When did you first hear about the U-turn, Greg?
I heard about it at the same time you did, Jo, probably about 7:30 this morning. I was surprised, but equally I'm not surprised because ultimately if you are going to have to reject a policy that you can't get through the House of Commons, then I think you would want to do that sooner rather than later. There's a lot of lessons here. From the 2012 budget, where George Osborne, and don't forget, in the 2012 budget, David Cameron and George Osborne were arguing to reduce the 45p tax rate to 40p. But ultimately that, and 50p to 40p, but it was compromised at 45. That ultimately didn't turn out to be the most controversial part of the package. And what happened was the government eventually U-turned on things like pasties, caravans, but 3 months later. So actually, here the lesson is, if you are going to have to change course, you should do as promptly as possible. And that is what happened overnight.
Well, what's interesting, though, is you say they had to because of political pressure, not because you thought the policy was wrong.
Well, look, I don't think any Tony Blair doesn't think the policy.
Well, never
is
mind
wrong.
about it. Did you think the policy was right?
I think having a 40p top rate of tax is correct. There might be a debate about timing and about the politics of that, but this has been something that has been advocated by David Cameron, by Tony Blair, by George Osborne, that actually a 40p tax rate is the correct policy.
Why did they do it? I'm really struggling to understand what their thinking was, because they must have been able to predict what has occurred. Why do you think they did it?
OK, politics and these things is always the art of the possible and dealing with the reality. It's what you think you can get through the House of Commons. And ultimately, not being able to get something through the House of Commons will kill off a policy. A good government, and I think here has been the right decision, has been to see that early and to make that climb down early, not have the thing stagger on. So actually, it has been active decisively to ditch something that wasn't going to get through.
Right, well, let's have a little listen, before I come to you, Tim, to Kwasi Kwarteng talking to BBC Breakfast a little earlier about his about turn.
The 45p rate was simply a distraction on what was a very, very strong set of measures. And with the Prime Minister decided not to proceed with the abolition of the rate.
Oh, the Prime Minister decided not to go. So it was essentially the Prime Minister leading on this now, the U-turn?
No, we talked together. I said this is what I was minded to do, and we decided together, we're in agreement, that we wouldn't proceed with the abolition of the rate.
Tim, does this smack of decisive government, as you heard Greg Howard say, or is this about a blame game?
That's the interesting thing, because in a previous clip, of course, Liz Truss said that it was a decision by the Chancellor to cut the rate. And here we have the Chancellor saying it's a decision by the Prime Minister to not cut the rate. So it does sound like they're sort of passing the buck between themselves. I mean, as I said before, it's not just a political mistake, it was a policy one as well, because it spooked the markets. And it was also a mistake because at a time of great suffering across the country, to be cutting the taxes for the very rich, even if, yes, OK, that rate was put up earlier, that's a mistake. But, of course, it is also political because let's not forget that in the battle over MPs' votes, Liz Truss only won about a third of MPs' support. The race among the members was a little bit closer than expected, and there is now a large number of Sunak-supporting MPs, who are now have decided overnight they're fiscal conservatives. They are now gunning for her. Grant Shapps is someone who, of course, was sacked by Liz Truss. Many of those MPs have not bothered to come to Birmingham. Those that are here, I would describe the mood as gloomy to grumpy. And I went to that 1922 party as well. I probably came in through the same bathroom window. And when Liz Truss spoke, the reception was friendly, but it was not the reception you give someone who's just won a leadership contest and just introduced a budget which is going to radically transform the economy of the country and do everything you've always wanted. When that U-turn happened over the 50p rate in 2012, that was 2 years into a new government, part of a coalition where they felt they were fighting to keep Labour and the SNP out and all that sort of thing. We're now 12 years into a Conservative government, and they're making mistakes like this. How can you not have learnt from all the politics of the last 12 years that this was the wrong time to do it?
Kwasi Kwarteng was asked if he'd considered his position. Should he?
No, I don't think you should. And I don't think it's in any way valid to say there's a difference between Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng. I've worked very closely...
She blamed him, he sort of blamed her, and then everyone is trying to blame the Chief Secretary to the Treasury.
No, I don't think they are. And actually, Liz Truss and Kwasi have worked incredibly closely. I've been actually the number 2 to each of them, first under Liz at Trade and Kwasi at Business until recently. I know them both very well. I also know they both know each other very well and instinctively trust each other. So I don't think there's any disagreement or kind of any sort of policy difference.
Well, it's not about disagreement, it's who's being blamed for the policy. And let's be clear with our viewers. Yesterday in that interview, Liz Truss said it was the Chancellor's idea to bring in that policy of cutting the top rate of tax. In the interview this morning, Kwasi Kwarteng said it was Liz Truss's plan to actually go against it and U-turn on it. So they are blaming each other. I want to go back to something that you tweeted recently. As a former Chief Secretary, you say to the Treasury, there is nothing inherently revolutionary or wrong with what the government is proposing on tax and budgets. All of the measures have strong merits and taken together may well be what's needed. Is that because of the high number of high earners in your constituency, Greg Hands, who would have benefited from the cut? They will be hugely disappointed, won't they?
No, well, let's think about, first of all, the bigger parts of the package.
No, let's just concentrate on this, because this is the story
today.
The energy
and the base rate of tax. But I do think, and I repeat, that the 40p top rate of tax has been, for 13 years of Labour government under Blair and Brown, was the top rate of tax. It was the top rate of tax advocated by David Cameron.
Wondering why you keep referring to Labour governments that precede 2010. We are in 2022, and your government's just performed a massive U-turn.
This is not an extreme policy to have a 40p top rate of tax. It is not something...
So why not stick to it?
Yeah.
Because I think the calculation was probably made. I don't speak for the government, but this was going to be difficult to get through. and actually retreating on something that you think eventually you're going to lose a vote on is the right thing to do.
But doesn't it call into question the judgment of the two most senior politicians in the country? That they may have this very close relationship. Maybe it's too close that they don't call each other out when they've got a frankly crazy idea that's never going to get through Parliament. Doesn't that worry you, that they've got such poor judgment that they couldn't see this huge iceberg coming?
Well, I think here, again, it's taking one small aspect of the growth plan here, slightly out of context. The bigger picture changes are the big energy bill package, which is really going to help people through this coming winter, and the tax cuts, £430 for your typical household in this country, which is going to make a big difference on the tax cut that matters the most.
But some of those tax cuts are, of course, reversals of tax rises. So they're actually a correction of errors made by the Conservatives.
Yeah. And the bankers' bonuses, I mean, the cap is being lifted on bankers' bonuses, so that's another bung for the rich, isn't it? That is staying in the budget.
Well, don't forget, of course, this country's got different ways of regulating bankers, and the way that we introduced reforms 2010 to 2014 in particular, other reforms that have taken place, the EU bankers' bonus rule, I think, was viewed as no longer being necessary given the UK regulatory regime that we got in place.
Can I just show everyone this headline, Tim? Because actually the Daily Telegraph leader column, the hysterical overreactions to the budget betray ignorance of history and economics. Do you think that Liz Truss and her government has made something of a fool of the Telegraph?
No, you can't do that. No, not at all. No, look, I'm not going to second-guess what my editorial line is before I've had my conversation with the editor. But I suspect a lot of people are going to be angry on the right that the government did something that they thought was right, that they came out and spent the last week defending, and then the government does a U-turn on it. I suspect that's not going to make their fellow travellers very happy.
All right, let's have a look at this. Former Culture Secretary Nadine Dorries, under Boris Johnson, widespread dismay at the fact that 3 years of work has effectively been put on hold. No one asked for this. Channel 4 sale, online safety, BBC licence fee review, all signed off by Cabinet, all ready to go, all stopped. If Liz Truss wants a whole new mandate, she must take to the country. It's time for an election, Greg Hands.
No, I don't think it is. And look, I'm not here to speak for the government. I'm a backbencher, as is Nadine Dorries. And backbenchers can have their views on these things. I don't think it's time for an election. The government has got a good working majority. We've just had a lengthy leadership contest where Liz Truss laid out her plans and in large part she is sticking to those plans.
Yes, she's added to those plans, and actually it was not the energy intervention that caused or spooked the markets, was it? Because that was laid out before the mini-budget was actually announced on the 23rd of September. The markets had priced that in. Do you accept that it is the £45 billion of tax cuts that were outlined, some of which she did talk about in the leadership contest, and that has resulted in mortgage repayments rising for thousands of people?
I think for full facts here, Joe, we ought to point out that, of course, sterling has recovered more or less to the point it was before the mini-budget. And secondly, even in the graph you showed, actually bond yields have also fallen from their peak. So if you're going to quote the market, I think you should give the current market.
And we will,
not just
because
the
we're going to speak to Michael. Do you agree that as a result of that statement on the 23rd of September, the markets were sent into turmoil as a result of those unfunded tax cuts, not the energy intervention, which we already knew about?
Well, look, I think that's a question you'd have to put to a market participant. You know, I am a backbench Conservative member of Parliament. I don't speak for the market. What I would say is that you should get the current market.
And we will. And we'll look at the graphs in just a moment. But to Nadine Dorries' tweet about saying Liz Truss doesn't have a mandate for what she's doing.
Yeah. Isn't the problem that the historic Boris win in 2019 was in almost a different country? He won saying, end of austerity, get Brexit done. It was a kind of it was a jam for everyone kind of a campaign. The problem is then, since then we've had COVID, we've had lockdown, and we've got the Ukraine war. The economic circumstances have changed, the leadership has changed, and there is now a far more right-wing economically prime minister in charge. So you have not just the country has a government that it possibly didn't elect, but also there are many MPs who got elected on a prospectus which is subtly changed. And among many red wallers...
Subtly,
quite dramatically changed. And many red wallers who back Sunak, their view is, look, I'm here to deliver the goodies for my constituency. And I don't believe the 45p tax rate does that. I don't think it plays in ex-Labour areas. But also I'm worried that when you do have to apply austerity in order to pay for these tax cuts, it's going to be my projects, my bus station, my hospital that doesn't get funded.
But can you understand, Helen, the surprise by the government? Because actually, Greg is correct. Most of what was unveiled was laid out very clearly in her leadership campaign. There weren't any huge surprises other than the cut of the 45p top rate of tax. Everything else was there for everyone to see.
Well, it was, apart from the rabbit in the hat, right? So I think that has got to be what tipped the markets over. And I think to suggest, as Greg has tried gallantly to do, that it's not blindingly obvious that there was a direct correlation between those announcements and the pound tanking is a bit laughable. But I think what we need to remember is, regardless of the gilt market, gilt bonds, all that sort of thing, this is not going to affect the thing which most people in this country care about, which is mortgage interest rates. And they are going to keep going up. And that is going to cause an enormous amount of pain for the Conservative Party, which has always painted itself as being on the side of homeowners.
What about the disappointment, though, in your constituency? Because you have the second highest number of high-income earners in Chelsea and Fulham, don't you? They will be upset that they've U-turned on this policy.
No, I don't think so. I think what my constituents are looking for, overwhelmingly, is a tax cut for everybody, which is what the base rate tax cut is largely going to do to 30 million households. That's what's important for them. It's important to have a grip on the public finances overall, which is also the direction the government is heading in. And also important that they have a proper energy package in place to help businesses as well as consumers with their rising energy costs. That's what my constituents are looking for.
All right, well, let's talk to Darshini David, the BBC's economics correspondent, because Greg Hands, quite rightly, is pointing to the graphs as they stand today in terms of movement in the markets, the pound against the dollar. What's happened after that reversal was announced, Darshini?
Well, it's been absolutely fascinating, Joe, because let's remind ourselves why the markets have been so jittery over the last 10 days or so, because we had those tax cuts unveiled. Now, £45 billion is about 50% more than they were expecting. They were already nervous about the scale of 30 billion. 45 billion is a different ballgame. How are you going to fund those? What does it mean for interest rates? Of course, what we saw over the last few hours with that U-turn, if you like, that announcement that the 45% rate in income tax was not going to be abolished after all. We saw the pound recovering some ground, but then trailing off once again. And the reason for that really is because £2 billion, because what this measure actually saves, isn't a huge amount out of £45 billion. But the questions they're asking in the market is this just the beginning? Is this the start of the lady turning, so to speak? Are we going to see more of the same? But they remain jittery because they still have many unanswered questions. And if you look at bond markets, which signify governments' borrowing costs and also households' borrowing costs, you can see there that after some respite in the early hours, they too regaining a little bit of ground, because many questions still being asked about what exactly these plans will look like, how they're going to be financed, indeed what it does mean for growth and interest rates, because let's not forget, all that turmoil we've seen over the last week has added enough to mortgage rates. If you're getting out a new fixed rate deal, then it'll cancel out any savings you would have made from tax cuts going forward.
Right, and in terms of those costs for homeowners, ordinary people looking at those mortgage rates, how much have they gone up by on average?
On average, you know, we're talking about hundreds of pounds here. So quite frankly, if you were taking out a 5-year fixed rate deal around about Christmas, you'd probably be looking maybe at 2.5%. Now you're looking at over 5%. So the interest proportion on that has doubled. And what does that mean? It adds up to hundreds and hundreds of pounds for the average homeowner. You can see why, with 2 million households due to remortgage by the end of 2023, there's so much concern about what this could mean. And it's not just households too, because as we've been saying, this adds to government borrowing as well. We know they're going to have to finance the tax cuts. That's likely to mean altogether, economists tell me, they're going to have to find £40 billion worth of savings. When you talk about things like limiting the rise in benefits, that only plugs a little bit of that gap. We are going to have to see a new wave of austerity, just as departments are feeling enormous strain on their budgets already when it comes to delivering those services.
Darshini, David, thank you very much. Greg Hands, a new wave of austerity. That's what we've got to look forward to, says the BBC's economic correspondent.
Well, I think, first of all, if I may, Joe, you've got to look at markets in the context of all the markets, not just the pound rate against the dollar, but the pound rate against the euro. And you've got to look at interest rates in the global context, where interest rates in the United States, interest rates in the Eurozone are also rising very substantially, with big increases in interest rates by central banks.
But what would you say to worried constituents of yours who are facing the sorts of rises from 2.5% to 5% for the average mortgage?
Well, I think mortgage rates are a big concern, and rising interest rates are a big concern. You've got to remember interest rates are historically were at historically very, very low levels. But equally, this is a global phenomenon. It's not a UK-only phenomenon to have rising interest rates. It's very much what's going on across Europe and across the United States and Japan.
As is the rise in inflation is a global phenomenon, and in some countries much worse than it is here. And Greg's right about that. It's one of the reasons why the 45p rate controversy was so frustrating, because it distracted from the bigger picture of what was really going on with this budget, which is the winding down of QE, switching away from a policy of easy money from the Bank of England. Yeah, switching away from policy of everything being driven by the Bank of England, just making sure there's plenty of cheap money out there, making interest rates higher, making it controlling that money supply, and instead shifting responsibility to the Treasury for it to generate growth through things like tax cuts and investment in infrastructure. There's a radical restructuring of the way we do economics going on in this country.
I mean, when we talked to Labour last week, Helen, many of the things that have been issued by Kwasi Kwarteng, like the cut in the basic rate, the reversal of the national insurance contributions, right, they support.
Yeah, they do support. But I think what we've seen over the past month is a clear blue water between the two parties. And people have got a real choice now. Do they want to be on the side of a party which has shown its true colours? You know, they've admitted openly, we want to help rich people keep more money in their pockets, or do we want to be on the side of ordinary people, like the Labour Party were talking last week about investing in the green economy in order for jobs, in order to get household bills down with insulation and things like that?
I'm sorry, that's rubbish, because actually this government, when it comes to the green economy, has done an amazing job compared to the last Labour government. When we took office, 7% of our energy was generated by renewable energy. Now that figure is 43%. The number of homes that are rated energy efficient, still not enough, but has gone from 10% to 45%.
There have been so many schemes that the Conservative government has introduced that have completely...
But I'm sorry, but it's just wrong to say that the Labour Party has got a better record, will offer a better prospectus when it comes to green growth.
Are you going
that
to
is
match?
a big part of the growth plan, is green growth.
Are you going to match, then, the £28 billion a year that Labour is pledging to spend on green policies and tackling climate change, and add to borrowing more?
I think that'll be a matter for the government to lay out in due course. But what I am saying is that we've got nothing to learn from the Labour Party when it comes to green investment, which had a terrible record when they were in office.
Right. Are you disappointed that King Charles is not going to COP27, the next climate conference, having been told that he shouldn't go?
Well, look, I think that is a matter for King Charles, a matter for the interaction with...
Would you like to see him there?
Well, I'm expecting now, as I'm not a minister in the government, not to be going to COP27 either. So.
Right. In terms of uncertainty, the markets don't like uncertainty. They prefer certainty. After this U-turn, do you think the government will stick to its plan and other tax-cutting measures, or are they vulnerable too? Well, and I mean, we're looking at the cut in the basic rate. We're looking at the reversal of the planned rise in corporation tax, the scrapping of the increase in national insurance contributions. Do you think they are vulnerable too?
No, I don't think they are, for two reasons. First of all, those were laid out clearly in Liz Truss's prospectus for becoming elected leader of the Conservative Party and Prime Minister. I backed Rishi Sunak, but I recognise that the programme that she ran on for the Conservative Party included those. And secondly, I don't hear of MPs who will vote against a reduction in the tax rate that will yield a big gain of up to £430 for 30 million households. I don't think MPs are going to vote against it.
There is a problem, though, isn't there?
I don't think Labour MPs would vote against it.
There is a problem, though, potentially, that any of the gain from the tax cuts that are coming may be wiped out by high levels of inflation and rising interest rates. Do you agree?
Well, you're looking, Joe, as in any set of economic circumstances, having worked in the markets and having worked in politics, you're looking at a series of numbers that can move around quite substantially. You're almost looking at a 2- or 3-dimensional matrix. It's impossible to predict where energy prices will be, where interest rates will be, where government borrowing will be with any high degree of certainty. So you have to base your policy based on what you think is the most likely range of circumstances.
Well, let's look at the issue of spending cuts, potentially, and austerity. I just want to show you this tweet from Paul Johnson from the Institute for Fiscal Studies, because he says, from a fiscal point of view, it's important to remember the cut to the 45p rate was just about the smallest part of the mini budget. What was a £45 billion tax-cutting package is now a £43 billion package. The U-turn, in other words, is going to have no effect on fiscal sustainability. So how is the government going to balance the books?
Well, that'll be for the government to lay out in due course. And I think the Prime Minister and the Chancellor of the Exchequer have been clear that that is something they're going to lay out very, very soon. I think we'll just have to wait for that.
Can we wait until November the 23rd?
Well, I think we're just going to have to wait a little bit for them to lay out how it's going to be done.
I just think that for the last 12 years, the successive Conservative governments have lambasted Labour over their... that you can't trust Labour with the economy. How are they going to fund everything? And yet they've... Kwasi Kwarteng has brought out this huge bonanza of tax cuts, and he thought he could get away with not explaining how he's going to... Well, how is he going to find that money? Is he going to do George Osborne 2.0? Are we going to see yet more huge cuts to local authority spending? That was the sort of the way of paying for his Northern Powerhouse, wasn't it?
Right.
Or is it going to be big departments? How are you going to get £40 million of savings? How would you do it, do you think, Greg? What would you like to see cut?
Well, look, it is definitely the case that the size of government has grown over the last 5 or 6 years. Largely that's been due to the pandemic. You've got things like, I'll give you an example, the size of the civil service, which reduced by about 19% between 2010 and 2016, has recouped that loss of 19%, is now back to the level it was in 2010. What I think you need to do is to have a fundamental look at how you would approach public finances overall. The sort of thing that I did as Chief Secretary of the Treasury 2015, the longest spending review that this country has had that held its place for 5 years, is to do a comprehensive look at this and see where the savings can be made. It's undoubtedly true that government savings can and should be made.
Tim?
They're also hoping that the fuel energy support they're putting out won't cost so much because the price will fall, so they'll end up with more money to play around with. The direction of travel, again with this budget, is towards a smaller state. That is the long-term goal of Truss and Kwarteng, and that is what is going to create a real choice in the next election compared to Labour, which is saying yes to everything because it can, because it's in opposition. But that itself is starting to produce some unreal positions, to be all in favour of this green spending, but also to be in favour of cutting the taxes for everyone. How do you balance those two things out? I'm not saying that Truss and Kwarteng are taking this sort of Reaganite Republican line of shrink taxes to the point whereby you almost create a crisis in spending and therefore you have to cut the spending. But nonetheless, a legacy of this package will be that there will have to be austerity further down the line. And the interesting thing is, will that mean healthcare reform? Because that's the really big one.
Well, do you accept that you can't balance the books without some form of austerity? And where would the axe fall?
Well, look, I think there will have to be, and I think it should have to be, actually, some reductions in government expenditure. But it's not for me as a backbencher sitting here in your TV studio today, Joe,
please feel free.
Set a budget. I think it needs to be a proper.
But you accept that they will have to make
exercise.
some sort of cuts. We heard Kwasi Kwarteng saying the government is going to stick to the comprehensive spending review in 2021.
Let's see, I don't think we're going to have long to wait.
Right. But at the same time, they intend to raise defence spending.
To 3%?
Yes. See, this is the thing that frustrates me, is there's a consensus around not discussing the things that cause spending to go up or the economy to suffer, because there's a consensus that we should do them. Lockdown, the Ukraine war, green policy, all these things, there's a consensus across the board. Of course, we have to do that. And now when it comes to Ukraine, of course, we have to raise defence spending. Yeah. Well, but that does have a cost. We have to pay for it.
It's all going to be paid for by growth, Helen.
Right. OK, good luck with that. I mean, I think that there's also an inability to accept that Brexit has also grown the state. If you look at the number of civil servants that have had to be appointed, for example, in the border force,
and it's had an economic cost. But Labour now supports it. This is my point. There's a consensus around all the major issues that drive the economy and spending. Everyone agrees on them. Labour ain't going to reverse the Brexit. It's not going to take us into the customs union. So therefore, we're all complaining about what the Chancellor's doing, but much of what he's doing is manoeuvring around things that we all agree he ought to do.
They've ruled out joining the customs union, I might add.
Right, OK.
They've ruled out joining the single market, but they haven't ruled out joining a customs union.
Let's concentrate on what the Conservatives are doing, since we're at the Conservative Party conference. And one of the issues, of course, politically, not just unrest and jitters amongst Conservative MPs here, but also those seats that were won by Boris Johnson in 2019 that gave Boris Johnson's government that huge majority of 80 or so seats. Let's talk to the academic and author Matt Goodwin. He joins us now. Matt, how is Trussonomics going down in the Red Wall, that area, historically Labour, that switched to the Conservatives in large numbers in 2019?
Yeah, good afternoon, Joe. The short answer is not well at all, like it's not going down well among all voters in the country. If you look at some aspects of the Truss agenda, you can certainly make the case that they are relatively popular, reversing the increase on national insurance, lowering the basic rate of income tax. The energy plan has widespread support, but it's the more controversial measures that have gone down like a lead balloon. If you look at things like taking the cap on bankers' bonuses, that's supported by 12% of all voters, and only a minority of those 2019 Conservatives. Abolishing the 45% top rate of income tax. OK, they've reversed it, but that was an 11% position. The planned changes on corporation tax, only 1 in 5 think it's a good idea. And here's the thing, Joe, just to go back to your discussion just now. If the Conservatives go into the next general election promising tax cuts alongside cuts to public spending, they will be completely wiped out. That position is supported by 6% of the country. Most voters, especially working class voters, do not want to live in an economy where taxes are being lowered and the state is being shrunk at the same time. I can't explain to you, Joe, how toxic that is for most voters. It's just not where they are. So I think what we're seeing is a philosophical difference here between a post-Brexit Conservative Party that at one point seemed to have grasped how the tectonic plates of politics have shifted, and this very different brand of Conservative politics that we've seen in the last month, which seems to be completely adrift from where the axis of politics is today. And I can't see myself how those 2 points are reconciled.
Just stay with us and let me put that to Greg Hands. If you go into the next election promising tax cuts and spending cuts, it's supported by 6% of voters. You will not only lose that election, you will lose a sizable number of your seats.
Well, look, let's see. What I would say is historically the Conservative Party has gone into quite a large number of elections pledging tax cuts and very successful election campaigns of the past. So I don't accept that for a moment. The tax cuts are unpopular.
And spending
certainly
cuts.
This tax cut, the one that will bring 30 million households, a tax cut of up to £430 on average, I think is going to be a popular tax cut. It's this kind of things that I think will get public support when it comes to a general election.
But do you want to take money from hospitals? Do you want to take money from schools? Like, I still don't get how are you going to pay for it?
Well, the whole point of the growth plan is to grow the economy and to make sure that we have got the money to be able to do both, ultimately, to give people back more of their own money, to be able to spend the way that they wish to spend, which is popular, as well as increasing that investment in schools, hospitals and other public services.
Matt?
Well, the problem with that is voters don't really think those two things add up. So if you ask voters, do you think that the policies that came out last week are affordable? 12% think they're affordable. Do you think that they're going to drive economic growth? 15% say they'll drive economic growth. Will they make you better off? 9% of the country think that Truss's policies will make them better off, and only around 1/10 and 1/4 of the Conservative Party's 2019 voters on balance think that these policies will make them better off. Voters don't just look at tax cuts in isolation. They also think about, what will this mean for the National Health Service? What will this mean for my schools? What will this mean for my GP and my ability to get an appointment? And what we've seen over the last 10 years, 15 years or so, is voters increasingly moving to a position where actually, on balance, they're okay, they're quite comfortable with paying a bit of tax if they get better public services. And that's basically where the median voter is. What they are adamant that they don't want is a kind of Davos on Thames, you know, shrink public services, shrink the state, cut tax, especially when, as the numbers this week show, and, you know, I was broadly comfortable with the post-2016 brand of Conservative politics. Joe, you and I have talked about that in the past. But I think one of the problems that voters sense with this brand of Conservative politics is that, firstly, the numbers don't add up and they don't think it's particularly competent. But secondly, they're worried that it's going to lead us into this sort of hollowed out state where the tax cuts are going to the better off and public services are even worse than they are now. And that's a sort of nightmare scenario for most voters and one they definitely don't want.
Tim?
I think historians will say that Brexit was a victory delivered by the right, but it'll be the left that will benefit. Part of the problem was some on the right understood what it was about. Boris understood what it was about. But the core of people who delivered Brexit are small staters. They wanted a Singapore on Thames. They wanted out of the EU because they were against regulation and high taxes in general, and they wanted that to be an impetus to creating a free-trading, globalized nation that would have a very small state. The irony is that what Brexit actually did was unleash themes of national identity and belonging, and promises were also made, like spending more money on the NHS. So in the long run, once the Labour Party fully reconciles itself to Brexit, it is much better positioned to tap into an essentially corporatist spirit. Whereas if the Tories abandon Borisism and populism and the spirit of 2019 and try and deliver instead on that very specific, which I have some sympathy for, and I know a lot of these people, and I like them and I admire them a great deal. But it's a very specific, narrow ideological point of view. If they try and deliver that, well, you know how many people support it. You've just been told, 6%, and probably half of them are here at this conference.
Are you still going to support the sorts of pledges that we've heard from Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng in their attempt to go for growth and risk alienating all those voters in those seats that the Conservatives won in 2019?
Well, I don't accept the premise in the question. I think it is perfectly possible to have a tax-cutting agenda.
But we're talking about spending cuts. If they're married with spending cuts...
to grow key services as well, or protect key services like schools. And don't forget...
But we've just shown you the figures. It won't be possible to do all of those things without some sort of...
Hold on a moment. Let's not forget what has happened not so long ago. The 2010-2016 period... we were actually protected spending on schools, we protected spending on hospitals, we introduced tax cuts, we grew the economy, and we won an election
Greg
as
Hans,
well.
there was a period of austerity, spending on pupils per head, flatlined. It never went up through that whole...
Through that
cash,
period,
but not in real
spending
terms.
was protected, and we won an election.
And there were still
tax
cuts.
Cuts.
Right.
The markets won't support this. That's the key thing. That's what we learned in the last few days. You're saying, and I get where you're coming from, that in a year or two, growth will be there such that we can plug the gap. But the markets don't believe you. And this is the irony. Tory party the markets. Brexit, all about the market. Cut taxes so the markets can flourish. But the markets want to see spending brought under control because they're nervous and they think the whole thing is just going to collapse.
One thing, though, Matt Goodwin, the Conservatives could win the next election, even losing a number of those seats in the areas that we have been talking about. And perhaps doubling down, to use that hackneyed phrase, on the sorts of parts of the UK that Greg Hans represents.
That's one possible scenario, Joe, not one that I personally would find plausible. Look, I mean, if you think that London, university towns, the prosperous areas in southern England that are full of university graduates and middle-class professionals are going to vote Conservative at the next general election, then, you know, some people might say they have a bridge to sell you. I mean, I think the reality is the value divides in British politics have put certain groups and certain seats outside the outside of reach for the Conservative Party for a long period of time. And that's why prior to the new Prime Minister coming in, many people were making the more convincing argument that the future of the Conservative Party is actually leaning into the post-Brexit realignment and doing more for many of the areas that we're talking about around levelling up, around making sure that they can use the state to make the economy a lot fairer and so on. As Tim says, the party has gone in a different direction on that. It's clearly backtracked on that. Most of the gains from these policies will go back to the city, London, prosperous parts of the southeast, all of those areas that many Brexit voters, to be honest, thought they were pushing against when they were voting for this new status quo. And so I've talked about this before. This is the nightmare scenario for the Conservative Party. They not only lose a big chunk of the blue wall, but they lose...
I think we're going to have to interrupt you because that's all we have time for. And I will be back this afternoon with more Politics Live, covering the Chancellor's speech at the Conservative Party conference. That's at 4 o'clock here on BBC Two and on BBC iPlayer.